Hi everyone, welcome to our DAT weekly market update. This is our update for December 9, episode 319. I'm Dean Croak, market analyst here at DAT, along with co-host Chad Kennedy. And my boss, Ken Adamo, makes a welcome return. And a special guest today is Jason Miller. Great to have you both with us again.
Good morning.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Yeah. This is our end of year session that we've been having for the last 2 or 3 years, where we have a look back at last year and a look at what we think might happen next year. So how's things up your way, Jason?
Well, snow finally melted. We got a little bit of a surprise snowstorm last week. So at least that's calmed down. Grades are submitted, so I'm off the hook for the stuff I immediately had to get done.
Right. Hey, Ken, you're back from a hunting trip?
I am. It was blizzard-like conditions for a few days, but recharged the batteries a little bit. I only got the car stuck one time. Spent 2 hours digging it out of a tube track. But other than that, I'm here.
Right.
Excited to be back.
Yeah, I noticed capacity was pretty tight across the Great Lakes region and upstate New York last week. So I think there was some pretty slow going up that way with that nasty weather. All right. Jason, for those that don't know you, and there can't be too many, tell the folks a little bit about what you do up there at the university.
Yeah, so I'm a professor here at Michigan State in the supply chain department. A lot of my research focuses on various parts of trucking, and then I do a lot of economic commentary, about the freight markets, but also broader macroeconomy.
Right. Awesome, thank you. All right, we'll do an abbreviated market update today, and then we'll bring you and Ken back in a little bit later. So just stand by. Some of the key trends we're watching this week. Spot rates, a lot of seasonality in the market this week. Last week was a catch-up week post-Thanksgiving. Rates are sitting at about 8 cents a mile above this time last year, but really a lot of seasonality. Ratecast has been pretty accurate so far. We're watching a couple of things. The lettuce and salad transition from Salinas to Yuma, Arizona is underway. We're starting to see a lot more volume come out of those markets and less coming out of Northern California. Jason's going to talk a little bit about this later. I think the ISM PMI came out last week, and to quote his LinkedIn posts, finally some good news and some directional improvement in the November numbers. November imports came out this morning. Preliminary numbers show volumes are down about 6% month over month, so peak season has certainly passed after 2 consecutive months of declines. Volumes are still up about 20% year over year. Of course, this week is Wreaths Across America week. What started in 1992 with one truck has grown to the country's longest veteran parade. It's underway. It's coming through Maine right now and was in Boston yesterday, and it's making its way down through Connecticut into Arlington for the wreath laying ceremony this Saturday, where I'll be. About 2 million volunteers nationally at 4,000 locations will lay wreaths this coming Saturday. It's quite the logistical exercise. And in this week's market update, which will be out this evening, we're looking at the history of road trains in Australia. It's a really good read, if I don't mind saying so, and why that country has the largest population of wild camels anywhere in the world. Of course, we'll have some more on the Wreaths Across America event and a little bit on Noble Mountain Christmas trees in Oregon. That'll be published this evening. So quick market update, load to truck ratio in dry van sitting at about 16% higher than the same week last year at 6.50. In refrigerated, load to truck ratio last week ended at 8.67. Same week last year, it was about 6.49. Last week's flatbed load to truck ratio stood at 15.81. That was significantly higher than last year's 10.94 for the post-Thanksgiving catch-up week. In year over year look at spot rates, even though the volume of loads moved last week was up about 7%, they're still about 3% lower than the same week last year. We're still seeing the exodus of small carriers evident in the market, with some tightening. Rates are up a penny per mile. National average was sitting at about $1.72 excluding fuel last week. That's about 7 cents a mile higher than this time last year. In the refrigerated market, national average stood at $2.05 last week, 10 cents a mile higher than last year and about 7 cents a mile lower than 2022. In flatbed, spot rates ended the week at $1.97, about 7 cents a mile higher than last year and about 6 cents a mile lower than in 2022, also identical to the 3-month trailing average. Quick look at our forecasts. Again, not a lot of surprise here. The forecasts have been pretty consistent in the last few weeks. For those new to the show, this is our short-term forecast out 35 days using our flagship RateCast product in green. It's predicting what rate view will be 35 days out, more heavily weights long-term seasonal trends, and it's bound by some higher and lower forward-looking error bands in gold and red. This is for loads moved. The blue line is the 7-day weighted average of loads moved over 550 miles. So this is a long-term line haul only fuel forecast excluding fuel. So again, a lot of similarity. We're seeing some pretty strong demand in the market seasonally in the next couple of weeks. Capacity will drop off between Christmas and New Year, hence the spike in the forecasts. All three forecasts show a spike between Christmas and New Year. In dry van, RateCast is expecting rates to go up about 12 cents a mile between now and the 10th of January, ending that forecast period at about $1.86. The low case scenario has rates up 5 cents a mile, high case scenario up 20. But again, you'll see rates start to peak around the 2nd and 3rd of January before they start the journey south. In the refrigerated market, RateCast is expecting rates to dip about 5 cents in the next few days before taking off in the final 2 weeks. A lot of the movement in the reefer market will be after Christmas, certainly between Christmas and New Year. Last year, we saw about 19 to 20 cents a mile lift in that period. And in flatbed, RateCast is looking for an 8 cent per mile lift out to January 10, the end of the forecast range for this week, ending that range at about 207. That's about 5 cents a mile up on the low case scenario and about 12 cents a mile higher on the best case scenario. So that's the spot market update. Over to you, Chad, for a look at the contract market.
Yep. Thanks, Dean. So everything here that I'll report is a shipper to carrier or broker perspective, whereas Dean's been covering that broker to carrier perspective in the spot market. So we do have contract rates in here. So starting with the yellow graph here, the spot premium ratio, this measures the difference between spot rates and contract rates that shippers pay. This represents about 15% of freight that shippers are moving in the dry van market. So we're still sitting at negative 6.9%, slight trend up and to the right. And the new rate differential, this measures the difference between new rates coming into routing guides versus the rates that they replaced. So we're at positive 0.5%. We've been bumping around that zero and just north of zero over the last several weeks. So that's a positive sign for carriers and brokers. Shippers are certainly preparing for rate increases next year as this trend continues up and to the right. Contract rate index still pretty flat. And then moving on to reefer, spot premium ratio continuing to trend up. And we'll see that in just a minute when we look at the rate per mile trends really clearly, but still at negative 4.7. So shippers still benefiting in reefer when they're able to use spot versus contract. That's still only about 15% of their freight. New rate differential still at negative, hasn't had that positive tick yet that we've seen in the dry van, so at negative 0.4%. And contract rate index still pretty flat. Flatbed, we'll skim over here pretty quickly, but that spot premium ratio is trending up and to the right, still at negative 4.7%, and contract rate still pretty flat. And now on to rate per mile for all three modes. You can see that in the middle, that temp control rate per mile that shippers are paying is trending up and catching up with that contract rate there. So yeah, that's a wrap. It looks like this is how the rest of 2024 will shake out, and looking forward to what you guys have to say about 2025.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's bring the guys back in. We'll ask the same question, Jason, that we've been asking Anthony Smith a couple of weeks ago, Zach Rogers last week, Tim Denoyan next week. What do you think the state of the economy is going into 2025, and what some challenges may be in the coming quarters?
Yeah, so I think we're going into 2025 finally with some tailwinds behind the trucking market, which we haven't been able to say for the last 2 years. We've got interest rate cuts. We've had 75 basis points of cuts, expecting another 25 basis points here in December. So that'll be a little bit of a tailwind on the residential construction side. So good news for the flatbed sector, good news for those manufacturers of wood and windows and bricks and, things like that. Those lower interest rates should make machinery investment a little bit more palpable. So hopefully, again, some more demand on the steel side. We've had, steel production has been quite low this year because machinery demand has been essentially steadily falling throughout the year. And then the auto sector, I posted this, on LinkedIn not that long ago that, we had phenomenal sales for light trucks and SUVs here in November, the third best month of all time, trailing only March and April of 2021. So that's a welcome news for the automakers because we're starting to see those dealer inventories get a little overburdened. So right now we've got quite a few tailwinds coming in. Now, it is going to take a while still, I think, for demand to truly materialize. So I, have been cautiously telling folks I don't think the market really has a chance to turn till March, April of next year in carriers' favors. So in general, there's some tailwinds, but there's also a lot of uncertainty, primarily due to what's going to happen with tariffs.
That's a pretty good take. Ken, what's your thoughts on next year and what's some things we need to be watching for?
I think post-election, I'm less concerned about regulatory changes. I don't think speed limiters, I think some of the EPA stuff will be of less concern than what we thought at DATCon pre-election. I think if the states choose to wrestle down some of that sustainability-based regulation, it'll happen like CARB and probably just cause headaches in New York and California and a few other places. So I'm less worried about that. I'm not as educated as Jason on tariffs, so I don't stay into that. Unlike some folks, I don't tend to boisterously proclaim a position without having a ton of intimate knowledge behind the scenes. That actually wasn't a dig at anyone in particular. I've learned to not do that from my own faults. That, just to be clear, I wasn't making that remark in regards to anyone specific. But I do think the tax cuts would have. We have tape on that. It's college football playoff season, so I'm going to use a sports reference. We have tape on what the last round of Trump tax cuts did in kind of announced in 17, went effect into 18, if memory serves. So I think if we get an added bonus there of some corporate tax cuts as well, it could put a little bit of the wind in the sails in the second half of next year. But I certainly, if next year, I've maintained this for the better part of a year and a half, if next year is not better than this year, I think you start to tiptoe into like catastrophic impacts on carriers. Like they cannot, the entire narrative of they have a rainy day fund or PPP loans completely becomes moot at that point. That you will start to see like an extreme over exit of carriers, which will probably just snap the market back into a frenzy in 26 if that were to happen. But again, I don't foresee that happening. I just think the least likely scenario is it's another year of flat behavior.
Ken, do you think from a shipper perspective, the second half of next year could look any different than first half, although it be flat, maybe some gradual increases?
I forget what I was on record with on Capitalist's show, but I frankly think like this time next year, we'll probably see spot rates 10 to 12% up and contract rates 4 to 6 with maybe a 2% upside to 8% up as we sit here today, a week or two before Christmas. They're going to be lapping very favorable year-over-year comps. I don't think that's like a hot take. It's not like rates are going to be like, we're going to be smoking cigars and drinking brandy this time next year. It's just, I think, just the mechanics of it, that 13 to 17 cycle would have paced us to about 12 to 15% up on spot rates. And that's probably where I think we'll be at this point next year.
I think that seems reasonable after 2 years of decreases to take about 6 to 8% on the increases. I think we see about a 3.2-3.5% increase if you draw a linear line over the last 10 years. Yeah.
No, I think that's right. The one thing I'll add, shippers, we heard at DATCon, I talked to 2 shippers at breakfast, and they said, if you gave me a choice between taking a 2 to 4% price increase or getting 15 to 20 day incremental payment terms, I'm going to do the payment terms every day and twice on Sunday. Because the cost of money is so much higher right now that 15 days at whatever their typical lending rates and supply chain financing rates are far outweighs 2 to 4% that they're probably going to get whacked with anyway in the tail half of the year. So 120, 180 day payment terms, I think that would probably be fine. That would be a fair trade-off in a shipper's mind. Wouldn't you agree for a 2 to 4% price increase?
Yeah. Makes sense. I don't think many of our smaller carriers on the listening audience side have that option, but I guess maybe if they're factoring, but the larger carriers and brokers can make those kinds of adjustments. Makes sense. Yeah.
Jason, Ken touched on tariffs. You've been pretty vocal about tariffs and the potential impact on LinkedIn posts. I've been enjoying those. What's your take on it this week?
Yeah, so the real question is what actually gets implemented, right? Because that is so much of the discussion of how much of this is negotiations. which all I'm going to say for those of you who think this is the most ingenious negotiating strategy ever, if you know you're coming to somebody with something that's not realistic, then that doesn't actually make it as good of a negotiating standpoint, right? So there is a question of, it can't all be bluster. If some of it doesn't get implemented, then no one's going to take it serious. So my general view is, if you go with a blanket Canada, Mexico, I'm talking no exemptions. So Canadian crude oil is now 25% more expensive, is an importer type of thing. That is not going to be good from the freight market standpoint. My state of Michigan is in the crosshairs because the auto sector is by far the most exposed industry in North America in terms of cross-border trade. And so this will be inflationary. We have, again, just as Ken mentioned, we have a tail of the tape for 2019. And that was a bad year for the trucking sector. And a big part of it was we had a major manufacturing slowdown. And there's been research by economists that have linked part of that slowdown to declining exports, and specifically amongst the manufacturers who saw their imports increase the most in price because of tariffs, you become less competitive. And one thing I'll be sharing, this week, something, in a lot of sectors, 15, 20% of the value of our exports are based off of imported components, mostly from China, Canada, and Mexico. And so that's where you get a lot of these, complex issues. And, the reality was furniture manufacturing in the United States fell from 2017 through 2019, despite tariffs being in place. And so my attitude is tariffs are not something that the trucking industry should be looking forward to, because other than a potential demand pull forward for a little bit, it ends up taking volume off the road in the long run.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the thing that's hard for us to do our job is that there's no rhyme or reason of the people that are being put in place to carry forward this. Like, you can't trust that, okay, well, tariffs is a platform item. So people who are seasoned in global macroeconomic deployment of policy changes will be the ones overseeing it. It's no, it's someone who worked at a Bath and Body Works for a summer. That's who's going to be deploying the tariff strategy. It's and again, this isn't political, because the current head of the Department of Transportation is equally unqualified to the person I'm about to mention. But it's oh yeah, pick the guy who was on road rules. He probably knows about the DOT. It's well, that doesn't kind of correlate to what we probably need in these positions. So I'm hesitant to go out on a limb, because even if the intention is there to do what Jason said, I'm very skeptical that it'll be deployed with any degree of reasonable efficacy. Maybe I'm just an old curmudgeon. I don't know.
No, and for me, the one good thing is we have a lot of research on the effectiveness of tariffs, and they just weren't effective at achieving things like increasing manufacturing employment. The sectors that saw the biggest tariffs didn't see their payrolls go up. And what you end up getting is you get a sector, let's say steel production, that employs only 80,000 people. Now, I'm not trying to dismiss that number, 80,000, but trucking employs 1.5 million on payrolls. Fabricated metal production employs 1.45 million people on payrolls. Department stores employ 1 million people, for crying out loud. And so what you end up getting is you see increases in prices for certain commodities, because what will happen is the domestic producers will raise their prices. If all of a sudden foreign imports become more expensive, guess what? The domestic producers will raise prices. And that just makes all of these downstream entities, your small mom and pop machine shop in southern Michigan, or this, heat treating, engraving, and, small factory in northern Wisconsin, all of their inputs now start becoming more expensive, and they're less able to compete. And that's the challenge here, is that tariffs are going to do nothing to increase productivity. And if we really want to drive growth in U.S. manufacturing output, frankly, we have to be more competitive than other countries for certain types of goods, especially if we want to grow our exports. And the scary thing is our productivity in manufacturing is actually down from where it was in 2010. And at best case scenario, it has been purely flat for 14 years. if you look back in the 50 years before that, there was a steady upward increase in productivity. And so that's, as I'm thinking, what policies benefit the trucking sector. It's how do we make our manufacturers more competitive so that they're better able to compete on a global marketplace.
Jason, on the subject of tariffs and sort of semi-related to nearshoring, Noam Mahoney at Freightways had a great article on the weekend about the Mexico National Guard's attempt to reduce the number of violent cargo thefts where the criminals are intercepting cargo trucks while they're in transit. The number of events are up about 1% year over year, according to the article. But part of me wonders about the impact of nearshoring, right? So we talk about the convenience of Mexico to the US from a manufacturing point of view. But I see lots of roadblocks, right? I mean, the crime part of it is a big component. So is the border as it's related to immigration and threats to shut down the border. Do you have a view on how that might play out?
Yeah, so this is the challenge is, Mexico right now is a lower cost manufacturing country than China. So the roles have flipped from where we were 25 or 30 years ago, where, a lot of the decision was even moved from Mexico to China to arbitrage on labor rates. And so I think in general Mexico is still positioned very well, as there's, I think, amongst, the global players that do such a large share of international sourcing, this desire to be diversified away from China, even excluding the tariffs, but just simply from we don't want to be so vulnerable to the actions of one country. So we saw this, with all the COVID lockdowns and all the disruption that was created. And so I think Mexico is well positioned to continue to gain. Truck crossings right now northbound into the U.S. were up, I think, 20% in the second quarter of this year relative to the second quarter of 2019. So kind of this compounded annual growth of about 3 to 4% a year. But it is a question of how much capacity is there in Mexico to absorb additional, volumes from China. Same way, how much capacity is there in Vietnam to absorb, volumes, or Malaysia, Indonesia, India, maybe to a lesser degree. But the reality is, when you look at the wage differentials, if you offshored something to go to China 25 years ago, there's no way it's going to be economic to make that type of good in the United States with our wage rates where they're at. And so that's the challenge on this front. And, think about kids' furniture. I got 2 young kids. I need something for their room. If I can go to Target and buy something for $70 that I can slap together in 20 minutes that the kids are going to beat up, that's what I want. I'm not going to pay $600 for something custom made in the United States. That's just not what I'm going to do. And other than that, I'm just going to substitute and say, you know what, you get clear plastic storage, kiddos. So that's the brutal reality that folks are looking at.
Right.
I'm curious about, I know Doge has been in the news quite a bit, right? You got Elon Musk and Ramaswamy coming into politics here. So are there any areas of regulation in trucking that are ripe for deregulation as a result of all this?
Oh, I'll have a crack at that one. I mean,
Sure.
that's the zero emission vehicles is a easy one. I think there'll be a definite rollback of some of those mid 2030s regulations, where I think the number was something like 14% of fleets had to be zero EVs by I think it was 2035. I know that a lot of the drayage companies in California have to be zero emission by 2030. So you could see some slow rolling of those. I definitely think the speed limit is off the table in the short term. I think there'll be some serious pushback against that. But so there's 2, I think. But I think there's some broader implications Jason's spoken to in some of his LinkedIn posts about the impact on things like solar panels and infrastructure around battery-powered cars that could be affected if there was a slow rolling of some of those projects that rely on grants.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
What about the upcoming labor union potential strike on the East Coast, Gulf Coast? I think they're reset to renegotiate in late January for
January
automation.
15th.
Yeah.
And then 3 days later, the inauguration happens. And
right.
the first thing Trump will sign is the Taft-Hartley Act. which sends them back to work.
Right.
Yes, I would agree. The timing of the fact that would fall on Wednesday, I was literally just looking at my calendar. You get effectively a couple days of strike. I cannot fathom the Trump administration lets that strike move forward. So I don't think it'll be that disruptive. I was literally just polling before our meeting. What was the Census Bureau's read on the amount of imports that came in through, the Eastern Gulf Coast ports in October, and it was the third best month in history. It trailed, actually, interestingly enough, last year, but then it trailed 2022. And so it kind of just tells you it didn't really have much of an effect. It didn't change the market in any type of meaningful manner.
I think it's problematic because what they're negotiating for is an inevitability that it's going to happen, right? Like, if you really get into the nuts and bolts of what they want, it's like they want people, in the gatehouses and not RFID based tolling. It's like this automation piece is something that's not going to be solved with a pay increase or any of the things that largely resolve the rail or the UPS or the UAW strikes. So I think there's going to be some probably contention around it, but I think you'll probably see something very similar to a Reagan-esque sending the air traffic controllers back to work kind of deal would be my best guess.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Jason, any early reads on the September TTMI that should be out soon?
Yeah, so October will be coming out. I rolled September in, just did it quarterly because there was nothing really exciting. October's reading is going to be still a little rough because of the Boeing strike cascading over to fabricated metals and things like that. Looking, where ISM was at in November, the new orders, we were ever so slightly expansionary, but a reading of 50.4 seasonally adjusted doesn't get me that excited. You really need readings of 55 or even above 60 before that really indicates, hey, manufacturers are seeing an uptick. Be sharing, soon. You look at fabricated metal production in the U.S., it is really, really, really weak right now. And again, part of that's the Boeing strike, but that also helps explain why the LTL carriers in their sort of mid-quarter updates are saying, we're down year over year right now in October and November. So we still have a ways to go, I think, till volume really truly starts to increase. And I do think the one lesson everybody's going to take away from 2024 is that it's not containerized imports that drive the market. I mean, this has been a phenomenal year, and the market really has not moved whatsoever. And so I think that the lesson that people thought was being played out with COVID was actually something very distinct, and that was much more huge increase in residential construction. Basically, every manufacturing sector was going as much as it possibly could go. And then the Fed took the punch bowl away starting around March of 2022, and things cooled really, really, really fast.
Jason, maybe it's a couple of years, you and Ken, on capacity. We saw another large truckload carrier in Texas declared bankruptcy last week. I think it was something like 800 trucks. This time of the year, that would seem unusual, but then maybe it's not, considering how lean margins have been all year. It feels like heading into the first quarter of next year that we could see some more capacity rebalancing before we're done. What's your thoughts on what the first quarter is going to look like from a capacity perspective?
So we'll typically see a large drop in payrolls in that dry van truckload space each January. So there's a lot of folks you can tell that probably pick, okay, I'm hanging it up at the end of the year, plus just a little bit with seasonality. I think, historically capacity has continued to exit even after the market cycle starts to turn. So we saw, in the global financial crisis, freight volume started to rise by Q3 of 2009, but capacity didn't bottom out until March of 2010. So there was almost like a 9-month lag between the two.
Right.
And so I do think that we'll probably see a little bit more capacity realignment right now. I do think with the election outcome, given the political leanings of the industry, that will actually cause less capacity to leave than would have left with a different presidential election outcome. So I think that throws a little bit of a wild card in the mix, because clearly the vibes in trucking have improved. I would say more than what the data has shown improvement, right? So the vibes are good, but we're not quite seeing that demand yet. Spot rates, if you include fuel, haven't really changed that much from this time last year. We're not seeing tender rejection rates, even following 2019 levels. FreightWaves data that they released, is showing a pretty big gap between where tender rejection rates were this time in 2019 versus where they're at today. And so I think there will be a little bit more of some capacity exiting out as we move through Q1. And then we'll just have to see, where the balance of, where spot rates are at and how things are going to see if, more folks stick around. Yeah. I agree with Ken that if something happens and next year is not substantially better, then it will actually, I think, even cause us to really rethink, like, what is going on with market cycles? Because kind of for me, that's a concern, is we've always had these cycles that take place. This is like normal. If we go into a third year without it, unless there's some big reason freight demand doesn't start to increase, I think we do really have to look and ask ourselves, like, what is going on here in this industry?
Yeah. It was interesting. ACT Research numbers came out. Tentative numbers, they'll be confirmed on the 15th, but the headline was that Class 8 truck orders in November tumble, which is kind of not what normally happens immediately after you see order books open. So maybe there's some trepidation on the large carrier side in terms of their rebalancing effort also.
Well, and if you look, even take like PACCAR, right? They were still up, or at least neutral year over year through the second quarter of 24 in terms of things from 23. And 2023 was their best year ever.
Right.
And so it really took till the third quarter of this year till things started to cool substantially relative to where they were in 23. And so I think just all the material shortages and the labor issues, it just threw that normal market cycle off, which, I mean, before COVID was a very predictable. Spot rates go up, more equipment gets ordered, spot rates go down, less equipment gets ordered. The delay in that has been so pronounced. And so, we've had the private fleet equation of, a lot of private fleet expansion took place because service was so terrible in 21. And the price increases were so pronounced. Shippers said, I'm going to do it myself. How is this playing out? What percentage of those Class 8 orders that we saw, let's say in 23, were private fleet versus destined for the for-hire market? And I don't think we really have a good, grasp of that yet.
Yeah, and the split between day cab and sleeper cab to the regional long haul split. We'll be talking to Tim Denoy about that next week on the show. Chad, and maybe Ken can weigh in on this. How are we looking bid season? We're coming towards the end of the bid season. What are we hearing on the shipper side?
Yeah, so it's been a mixed bag. It looks a lot like our new rate differential, bouncing around 0%. Shippers are telling us they're taking some small increases on some lanes, small decreases on other lanes. For some shippers, it all depends on where you started out. If you haven't had a bid in 2 years, you still might be able to get some decent decreases. They're expecting, just about what Ken said there, maybe a couple points in the first half of next year of increases, and that's through routing guide leakage, not just the RFP. And then maybe a little bit more increases in the second half of next year. I've even heard some shippers talk about maybe splitting their bids, give me a first half rate, second half rate, see what that looks like, compare it to a full year rate. So testing some different strategies there, but I think it's that slow, steady rate growth is kind of the expectation from the shippers. Anything you'd add to that, Ken?
No, I mean, we've been in a relatively low rejection. Like routing guides have held up pretty well for coming up on 2 years now. So I think probably at the first sight of material breakdown in the routing guides, which could happen this spring with produce, it doesn't seem like it's going to happen this. Not even, you don't have to be a produce shipper. That's just a colloquial way we talk about spring shipping for those new to the program. But I don't think we're seeing that much right now. Certainly, there are reports that things are a lot busier, but like there's a big difference between busy and holding up. Which again, we've been doing the show long enough, where we've seen all of these different climates, right? Like busy and holding up is probably a welcome change for a lot of brokers and carriers. I think once you get into like busy and prioritizing what to cover and what to let slip is what I think a lot of people are hoping for in that next step. And that'll probably happen. My guess would be in the spring would be its next chance for it to happen in earnest. So I think it's hard to say. My guess is a lot of brokers, a lot of the carriers that do direct contract freight might be more willing to preemptively try to renegotiate this spring if things get hairy. But there's no guarantee that's going to happen.
Yeah, that makes sense. Most of these major annual RFPs that go out, they've been negotiated over the last couple of months. And they'll go into place around March, April, and then produce season hits. So it'll be really interesting to see how those RFPs hold up and how routing guide leakage plays out Q2. Hey, I was going to ask if Ken or Jason, I know you've both written a little bit about broker margin transparency. Would you mind touching on that? Like, what is this all about, and what are the pros and cons of it potentially playing out?
I can tee it up.
Yeah,
Jason can slam it home. I'll alley-oop it to him. I mean, so the regulation had been on the books for a long time. It is largely a function, which was taught to me early in my days in logistics. It was a function. It used to be that shippers only cut one check to the carrier who worked with brokers, and the carrier was responsible for paying the broker their commission. So to keep the carriers honest, like if any one of us were working on a commission deal and we didn't get to see how much the percentage was taken out of, we would want audit rights for that. So that's largely the history of the rulemaking. And it's been on the books, like I said, I think since like the late 70s or early 80s. There's been a resurgent push by OIDA and some fringier groups to make some amendments requiring electronic disclosure versus paper records, making it mandatory within 48 hours. They're not changing the waivability, and then adding some new fields just to keep up with the times. My take, and I'll turn it over to Jason, is like margins aren't correlated with prices unless you get on like the extreme micro level where you have kind of extremely similar shipments. That, you know, it could dictate what gets paid out. The fact that you don't know it at the time of negotiation also makes it profoundly unhelpful, right? Knowing it 48 hours after you've already agreed to and hauled the load. And I think there's a bunch of like ancillary things that we can get into, which is like carrier reuse rates are very low. On average, carrier reuse rate in the brokerage industry is under 20%, which means as a carrier, you're getting 1 out of every 5 loads from the same broker. So you may go months potentially without hauling another load for that broker. Odds are you'll go out of business before you haul another load with that broker. It's actually an interesting little statistical riddle. If you juxtapose carrier turnover rates with broker reuse rates, your odds are more likely to go out of business before you haul 2 or 3 loads for a broker than other way around. So the industry turnover is like 80% plus, and carrier reuse rates, when you scrub out the bigs, like the mega brokers, is well under 10%. So, Jason, do you have anything to add there?
No. I mean, you know, to me, it's one of those things that when you look at any given point in time, the spread of bids for a spot load on the same lane, it would not be infeasible that you could get everything in terms of a winning bid if you were a large broker from $1.45 a mile to $3 a mile on the same darn lane within the same darn week. So the reality is that knowing that margin doesn't really help you inform the bid you place on any given point in time. And so my concern is that if you're a small carrier, you've got so many other things to do other than to try to figure this out. Because you know what? So what? Your broker made 40%. You wouldn't have known what the bid was anyway that was going to win on this. So given that spread exists, it just is not something that you should be chasing. Plus, what are you going to do? You're going to go to that shipper to try to get that freight? That shipper, if you're a 3 or 4 power unit carrier and it's a medium-sized shipper, you know, moving 20,000 loads a year, they don't want to talk to you directly. I hate to tell you, but unless you know the transportation manager there, they're not going to want to work with you. They want to work with a broker that can get them big hunks of capacity. And that's who they're going to have their contracts with. And they're going to let the broker do that matchmaking for them. And so it doesn't help you from a negotiation standpoint. So I think this is one of those ideas, like it sounds great, but in reality, it's not that useful. And I mean, Ken, you've posted a lot of great content. In general, that, roughly ballpark at 15% broker margin stays fairly stable. The one period that was somewhat of an outlier was the back half of 2022, because spot rates started falling precipitously through the year, but those contract rates have a lot more inertia and they held up well. But guess what? By early 2023, we were back to the 15% as we went through bid season. And so, brokers have to make money too. And when you look at how industry capacity has evolved before COVID, capacity today is far more fragmented than what it was a decade ago. We saw a 38% increase in the number of firms with employees in trucking between 2017 and 2022. And that was early 2022. And given the lags with how new firms are created, I guarantee you there was a huge increase into 2023. And so, for shippers, those brokers are never more important than before. And so, again, it's one of those things that you got better things to do with your time.
Yeah.
I think the last thing I'll say on it, right, is like, I love the spirit of doing your research, getting involved in the process, going to, submit a comment. The FMCSA right now is looking for comments. You should go read the 80 pages of proposed rulemaking and make a comment. It's your right. It's a civic, just same as voting, right? Your taxpayer dollars are funding this process. Well, I would research who's making each argument. I mean, I think myself included, right? Does my background make me credible to have an opinion on this that you should consider listening to? Does Jason's? Does Dean's? And I think when you look at some of the folks screaming loudest for transparency, I think what you'll find with a very quick Google search is it would be very unsurprising if this rulemaking went final that immediately little cottage businesses would pop up charging you to get access to your transparency. So I'm not going to comment on what specifically they've been accused of or, in some cases found guilty of or been involved with in the past, but I would encourage you to check it out, right? And I don't think that should disqualify for someone from advocating, to be clear. I just think it's hard to be partially well-informed is a phrase I found myself using a lot. Like, making a recipe with 80% of the ingredients, sometimes it might work out, right? Sometimes it's not going to work out. So I think if you want to be well-informed, I think well-informed isn't just screaming the loudest. So I would highly encourage you to read the rulemaking, read what different opinions and takes are on this, and go write a comment. It takes 15 minutes. And they have to read it, from what I understand.
Yeah. I think it's a case of be careful what you ask for. Coming from a carrier's perspective, transparency works both ways. I've been involved in some contracts where we have a cost-plus arrangement where we're completely transparent with our operating costs and profit margin, and it works well in a large contract shipper scenario. But there's trade-offs, and I don't know many owner-operators who would want to be completely transparent. Especially if you think back to, we had the May Day protests in 2020, and then later that year, our good friend Dan Deegan was paying $10,000 to move a 40-foot container from Los Angeles to Orlando. So it works both ways. I think people have got to be very careful what they ask for.
It's already happening, Dean. So I just saw a post this morning. Someone got put on a DNU list because they requested to see what the broker made. And they said, well, you can't do that. And I said, sure they can. They absolutely can, right? And I think that's what you're going to run into is the fundamental thing that underpins this entire show, quite frankly. The reason we're here talking about this and have been for years now, the reason DAT is in business and the reason Jason has students that probably line up to take his courses. This is a market of price takers. And sure, does it fit the absolute textbook definition? We went down this rabbit hole. Like, could you say with absolute certainty that it's a perfect information? No. And very rarely does it fit the full academic definition. But if you suspect that broker's making higher end margin on you or taking advantage of you, or you don't like how they talk to you on the phone, there's 24,999 others to go haul freight for. And if that broker doesn't like you or doesn't like the hassle of providing you transparency or doesn't want to risk back solicitation, there's 300,799, whatever it is, other carriers that they can go have haul that freight. And unfortunately, in this particular case, those are the facts.
Yeah. Jason, final word before we wrap up.
And, right now, 2024 turned out to be a blah year again. There was a lot of excitement at the start of it. I remember back in, late 2023, folks really thought 2024 was going to be the year to turn it around, but the fundamentals just weren't there. This year, we're entering 25 in a much better situation. There's still quite a bit of uncertainty. I do agree with the general take that, I've already put my forecast out. I'm certainly think 12 to 20% spot rate increase is very feasible if everything goes right. And we'll have to wait to see, what 2026 looks like as we start to see what the fiscal and monetary policy situation starts to play out. So I feel very comfortable saying 2025 will be better for carriers than 2024. I can't tell you much about 2026, though, until I start to see how things begin to play out.
Okay, got it. While we've got you, Jason, how can people get in contact with you if they would like to learn more?
Yeah, so best thing, connect with me on LinkedIn, or there's this amazing thing. It's called Google and my name, Michigan State. And shockingly enough, the university pays money. So I'll be about the first thing that comes up. And it has an email address. So
there you go.
So my statement is, if you can't find me, then there's probably some other issues there.
Yeah, we can always connect you up anyway. Thanks, Ken, for being on the show. A couple of shout outs. Freightman Podcast, Chris Kaplis is talking to former Coca-Cola executive Rob Haddock. Amongst other things, they're talking about artificial intelligence, and Rob's reference to Iron Man's AI-equipped suit Jarvis. He thinks that can make executives manage better using AI technology as opposed to a replacement. Next week's show, Tim Denoy from ACT Research. I'll be on Radio Nemo live at ATA headquarters this Thursday morning, ahead of the wreath-laying ceremony in Arlington. Make sure you set up alerts for our show and subscribe to our channel. With that, another show is in the books. Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Jason. And thanks, Chad. Be safe. Be nice to everyone. We'll see you here next week at 10 a.m. Eastern, 7 a.m. Pacific.